banks are failing, our currency is crashing, and the dollar will soon no longer be the world standard, which will be our greatest defeat in over 200 years.
That was former U.S. President Donald Trump earlier this week, voicing his concern about the possible demise of the U.S. dollar. And there is reason to be aware of, some would say alarmed by, the recent trend to abandon the dollar as the world's reserve currency. China today said that last month, for the first time ever, its cross-border transactions in its own currency, the yuan, surpassed those carried out in U.S. dollars. The announcement comes a day after Argentina said that it would begin paying for Chinese imports in yuan instead of dollars. Brazil will do the same. Russia also chimed in this week by claiming that the global move away from the dollar is, quote, unstoppable. Well, for more now, I'm joined by Lauren Gludeman. She is the China director of the Eurasia Group, which specializes in risk assessment for the business community. It's good to have you on the program tonight. These cross-border transactions in China, for the first time, more are being done in yuan than in U.S. dollars. I mean, how significant is this for the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency?
I would say that concerns about de-dollarization coming from the single dollar point, data point, are quite overblown. Yes, the yuan has increased as a share of China's own trade financing, but that's because it's China's currency. And I think what we can see from the data is that most of this increase has been in actual trade settlement, and it hasn't really been a reflection of more and more countries using the renminbi as their foreign exchange, for example.
Earlier this week at the UN, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, he had some hard words about the demise of the dollar. Take a listen to what he said.
Brazilian President Lula, speaking at a press conference in Beijing, called for moving away from the dollar and relying more on other currencies for international trade. The trend is irreversible. The Americans have been seriously harming their own interests, managing international finance and the world economy, using the dollar's dominant position. The flight from the dollar has already begun.
Now, Lauren, help us read Lavrov. Me thinketh the foreign minister do protest a bit too much. I mean, his comments, maybe they prove that Western economic sanctions against Russia are actually working.
I think he rightly points out that more and more countries are looking to alternatives of the dollar to evade sanctions. You pointed to a couple examples at the beginning of the segment where we have countries like Argentina, Brazil, Saudi Arabia agreeing to transact with China in yuan, in renminbi. And it's not surprising because there are new costs to using the dollar in light of sanctions against Russia. But I think we have to understand that the use of the renminbi for these transactions is still very, very small relative to aggregate trade, whether we're talking about trade with China or trade globally.
What about this talk that we've been hearing from the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that they want to develop a digital currency to be used instead of the dollar? I mean, what's that about?
Well, that's a great point. And I think digital currencies are certainly gaining more widespread attention. Most central banks around the world are looking into developing or at least studying digital currencies. And I don't think that's necessarily a reflection of de-dollarization. It can be related to just more efficient transactions. But again, you could see it as just another indication that developing countries are struggling to deal with increased costs of transacting in the dollar in an environment of rising geopolitical tensions with Russia, with China.
Yeah, I want to ask you, before we run out of time, I mean, how much of this, when we're talking about these countries, and, it's a long list, countries that say that they want to wean themselves from the dollar, how much of this is about more about geopolitics and less about economics?
You know, I would say it's mostly about geopolitics at this point. And for China, it's really diplomatic. It can be seen as almost transactional, where China is really looking for countries who it's trying to establish greater engagement with to essentially do it a favor, increase the legitimacy of the use of China's currency internationalization efforts by doing more trade in the renminbi. But again, geopolitics are a huge factor here. And there are more and more countries who are, and especially BRICS nations, who are finding themselves caught in the middle of US-China competition and escalating tensions, and who are looking for ways to essentially leverage their relations with both the US and China. And that can, we're seeing that really play out, I think, in the de-dollarization narrative here.
Yeah, and a lot of countries are also, you know, they have a balancing act that they're trying to master as well. Lauren, it's good talking with you. We appreciate your time and your valuable insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Families in Kenya are waiting to identify the bodies of relatives who were members of a cult and who were allegedly driven to starve themselves to death in order to get to heaven. Now, the cult's leader, Paul Mackenzie Natenga, is being investigated in connection with the deaths of more than 100 people.
Saying the names of their missing loved ones aloud as they wait to hear whether they've been found. Family members gather here in the Kenyan coastal town of Malindi to identify the remains of bodies recently exhumed from a nearby forest. All victims of a suspected religious starvation cult that has been in operation for several years. Stephen Muiti lost his family after his wife took their children to join the self-proclaimed Good News International Church.
My children are dead, I know that for sure. The young men who told me about my children had been living in the forest since 2021. They told me the names of my children and they didn't even know me. They told me my children had been starved to death.